The pounding on my door wasn't the kind of knock you forget. It wasn't neighbors. It wasn't friends. It was the sound of someone who thought they owned me. And my house. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when it started. 3 heavy thuds, pause, 3 more thuds. The kind of rhythm that says, open up or we're coming in anyway. I rolled out of bed, my feet hitting the hardwood floor of my bedroom, and checked the digital clock. 12:47 a.m. Through the blinds, I could see the glow of flashlights sweeping across my front lawn like searchlights hunting for an escaped prisoner. The beams were cheap and scattered, not the focused, professional illumination of real law enforcement. I'd seen enough tactical operations to know the difference. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, moving quietly through my house. 20 years in the bureau had taught me to observe everything, even in situations that seemed routine. Especially in situations that seemed routine. The knocking came again, more insistent now. Open up. This is official business. The voice was trying too hard to sound authoritative. There was a tremor underneath the bravado, the kind you hear from someone playing a role they've never actually lived. I approached the door but didn't open it, instead peering through the peephole. 3 men stood on my porch, dressed in what looked like police uniforms in the dim light. But the details were wrong. The badges caught the flashlight glare too sharply. They were too shiny, too new. Real badges get scuffed and worn from daily use. These looked like they'd come straight from a costume shop. The man in front was tall and thin, with a patchy beard that no real department would have allowed. His partner stood to the left, shorter and stockier, nervously adjusting his utility belt every few seconds. The third man hung back, almost hiding behind the others. His uniform didn't even fit properly. "We know you're in there," the tall one called out. "The Homeowners Association has issued an arrest warrant for multiple violations of community standards." "You need to come out now," I almost laughed. "An HOA arrest warrant? That's not how any of this works." But I didn't laugh. Instead, I unlocked the door and opened it slowly, keeping the chain latch engaged. I let confusion wash over my face, the kind of bewildered innocence that people expect from someone who's supposedly done something wrong but doesn't understand what. "Officers," I said, making my voice higher and more nervous than usual. "I don't understand. What's going on?" "It's almost 1 in the morning." The tall one stepped closer, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. His hand rested on what looked like a taser, but it was positioned wrong, not where a trained officer would carry it for quick access. "Marcus Thompson?" he said, reading from a crumpled piece of paper. "Yes, sir. That's me. You're under arrest for violation of HOA codes 4.7, 8.2, and 12.9. Failure to maintain appropriate lawn standards, unauthorized vehicle parking, and—" He squinted at the paper. "Disturbing community harmony," the shorter man piped up. "You've been causing problems for months, buddy." "The community has had enough." I nodded earnestly, like I was taking this seriously. "I can fix whatever's wrong." "Can't we just—" "No," the tall one cut me off. "You're coming with us, now." Here's what they didn't know. I was analyzing everything. The way the tall one's eyes darted left when he lied. How the short one's breathing was elevated. Classic signs of anxiety in someone performing under pressure. The third man's hands were shaking slightly, and he kept glancing toward the street as if expecting someone else to show up. Their tactical positioning was amateur at best. They'd bunched together on the porch instead of creating proper fields of fire. None of them had properly secured the perimeter. If this were a real arrest, any one of a dozen things could have gone wrong. But most telling of all was their equipment. Real police carry their radios on their left shoulder for easy access. These guys had them clipped to their belts, where they'd be useless in a struggle. Their handcuffs were the cheap kind you could buy online, not the department-issued Peerless or Smith & Wesson cuffs that real officers use. "Can I see some identification?" I asked politely. "I mean, your badge numbers?" The tall one's jaw tightened. "We don't have time for games. You can see our IDs at the station." What station would that be? The, the local station. Look, are you going to make this difficult, or are you going to cooperate? I pretended to consider this, all while memorizing their faces, their voices, their tells. The short one had a small scar above his left eyebrow. The tall one's uniform had a small tear in the left sleeve. The quiet one in the back had a tattoo peeking out from his collar. Something that looked like gang markings, not the kind of ink you'd see on a sworn officer. "All right," I said finally, closing the door. "Let me get my shoes and my keys." I heard them muttering to each other on the other side of the door. Something about easier than expected, and finally getting rid of him. The EE's short one said something about how I was just another scared resident, and how the HOA president would be pleased. That's when it clicked. This wasn't random harassment. This was organized, systematic. Someone was running a con game using fake authority to intimidate homeowners. The question was, how many others had fallen for it? I slipped on my sneakers and grabbed my keys, but I also palmed my cell phone and made sure my concealed carry permit was in my wallet. Old habits. Then I walked back to the door, took a deep breath, and prepared to play the role they expected. But as I reached for the door handle, a cold smile spread across my face. They thought I was prey. They didn't know who they were hunting. They thought I was just another black man living in their pristine HOA community. They had no idea that my past could dismantle their entire fake empire. When I'd moved into Willowbrook Estates 18 months ago, I was looking for exactly what this gated community promised: peace, quiet, and normalcy. After 2 decades working covert operations for the FBI, I wanted nothing more than to tend a garden, maybe take up woodworking, and pretend that the most dangerous thing in my life was deciding between cable providers. I should have known it was too good to last. The community was everything the brochure advertised: manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, a small lake with a walking path, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked from a Norman Rockwell painting. The kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways and kids ride bikes without parents worrying about traffic. But underneath that postcard perfection, something was rotten. It started small. A letter in my mailbox 3 weeks after I moved in, informing me that my mailbox post was not regulation height and would need to be adjusted within 10 days or face a fine. I measured it. It was exactly the same height as every other mailbox on the block. Then came the notice about my lawn. Apparently, my grass was inconsistent in color and density compared to community standards. This was followed by a citation for parking my own car in my own driveway. Something about it being visible from the street and creating an automotive eyesore. Each letter was signed by the same person: Margaret Whitmore, HOA President. I tried to handle it diplomatically. I attended a board meeting, introduced myself politely, and asked for clarification on the various codes I was supposedly violating. Margaret Whitmore was exactly what you'd expect. A woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, dressed like she was perpetually on her way to a country club luncheon. She sat at the head of the conference table in the community center like it was her personal throne. "Mr. Thompson," she'd said, not looking up from her papers, "the rules are quite clear. If you'd taken the time to read your HOA agreement thoroughly, you wouldn't be confused." "I did read it," I said, "cover to cover. 3 times, actually, and I can't find anything that supports these violations." That's when she looked at me directly for the first time. Her eyes were ice cold, and her smile was the kind you see on a predator sizing up prey. The board has discretionary authority to interpret community standards as needed to maintain property values and neighborhood character. If you don't like our interpretations, you're welcome to move somewhere more suitable to your preferences. The other board members, 4 older white residents who looked like they'd never disagreed with Margaret about anything, nodded in unison. Should have recognized the pattern immediately. In my FBI days, I'd seen this exact dynamic in organized crime families. a central authority figure surrounded by yes men, using bureaucracy as a weapon to control territory and intimidate opposition. But I was tired of seeing threats everywhere, tired of analyzing every social interaction for hidden agendas. I wanted to believe that this was just typical HOA pettiness, not something more sinister. So I paid the fines. I adjusted my mailbox. I reseeded sections of my lawn with different grass. I moved my car into the garage, even though it meant I couldn't use the space for the workshop I'd been planning. The harassment didn't stop. It escalated. More letters arrived weekly. My front porch light was too bright. My newspaper delivery was creating clutter. The small American flag I'd mounted by my front door was not in regulation, proportioned to the size of the house. Then I started noticing the patrols. Men in what looked like security uniforms would drive slowly through the neighborhood in unmarked cars, always slowing down when they passed my house. They carried clipboards and would occasionally stop to take pictures of various houses, but mine got photographed every time. When I asked Margaret about the patrols during another board meeting, she smiled that predatory smile again. The board has contracted with a private security firm to ensure community compliance. It's all perfectly legal and outlined in your HOA agreement. Section 15.7. If you'd like to look it up. I looked it up that night. Section 15.7 authorized the HOA to contract with appropriate agencies for community, safety, and standard enforcement. It was vague enough to justify almost anything, but something about those security officers bothered me. Their uniforms were inconsistent. Different companies, different patches, different equipment. Real security companies maintain strict standards for their personnel's appearance and gear. I started paying closer attention to my neighbors. The Hendersons, an elderly couple who lived 2 doors down, had stopped making eye contact when I waved. The Johnsons, a young family with 2 kids, seemed nervous whenever I was in my yard at the same time as them. One evening, while taking out my trash, I heard voices from the Hendersons' backyard. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, frightened. The next morning, there was a "for sale" sign on their lawn. That afternoon, Mrs. Johnson approached me while I was checking my mail. She looked around nervously before speaking. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I wanted to tell you we're moving next month." "Oh," I said. "I'm sorry to hear that. I thought you loved it here." She glanced toward her house, where her husband was watching from the window. We did, but—" She lowered her voice even more. "The board made things difficult for us after we supported you at that meeting. Fines, inspections, complaints to the city about our fence permit. It's easier to just go." That's when I started to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just harassment. It was a systematic campaign to control who lived in this community and who didn't. And anyone who didn't fit their vision or dared to question their authority would be driven out through a combination of bureaucratic warfare and intimidation. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was who they were really dealing with. For 20 years, I'd been the guy the FBI sent in when other agents couldn't handle a situation. Hostage negotiations with international terrorists, deep cover infiltration of domestic extremist groups, counterintelligence operations against foreign spies who'd been operating on American soil for decades. I'd been trained to spot patterns, to read people, to gather intelligence, and to take down organizations from the inside. I'd learned to be patient, to play whatever role was necessary, and to never let my targets know what was coming until it was too late to stop. Margaret Whitmore and her little kingdom, thought they were dealing with just another resident they could bully into submission. They had no idea that their fake police, their intimidation tactics, and their bureaucratic weapons were about to run headlong into someone who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of taking down criminal organizations, but I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how deep this corruption went, and how many people were involved. I started keeping files. Photos of the security patrols, records of every fine, every notice, every interaction, license plate numbers, names, faces. What they'd taught me at Quantico was that every criminal organization, no matter how small or how careful, eventually reveals itself through its patterns. You just have to be patient enough to watch for them. And I had all the time in the world. They didn't just want my house. They wanted to break me, and they had no idea what kind of storm they had unleashed. The fake arrests were just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, Margaret Whitmore's campaign against me evolved from petty harassment to something that bordered on psychological warfare. It started with the phantom violations. I'd wake up to find orange citation stickers plastered on my front door for infractions I couldn't identify, unauthorized garden modifications, structural alterations without board approval, noise disturbances during quiet hours. Each citation came with a fine ranging from $50 to $200, and each one referenced HOA codes that didn't exist in any version of the community guidelines I could find. When I challenged these citations at board meetings, Margaret would produce a thick binder of updated regulations that somehow never made it to the residents. The board would vote unanimously to uphold the fines, and I'd be told that payment was due within 7 days, or additional penalties would be assessed. Then came the surveillance. The unmarked cars became a daily presence. They'd park across from my house for hours at a time, the occupants taking photos and making notes on clipboards. When I approached one of these vehicles, the driver, a heavy-set man with prison tattoos on his knuckles, rolled down his window and claimed he was conducting a security assessment for the HOA. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of false respect that barely concealed a threat. "No problem," I replied calmly. "Just curious about all the attention my house is getting." He glanced at his clipboard. "Says here you've got multiple outstanding violations. The board wants to make sure you're not making things worse." "What violations?" He shrugged. "That's between you and the board. I just do what they tell me." But it wasn't just the cars. Motion sensor lights in my backyard would trigger at odd hours, activated by figures moving just beyond the fence line. My garbage cans would be knocked over in the middle of the night. My morning newspaper would disappear, only to show up later, torn and scattered across my lawn. The psychological pressure was expertly applied. Whoever was running this operation understood that isolation and unpredictability were powerful weapons. They wanted me to feel watched, harassed, and alone. What they didn't understand was that this was nothing compared to what I'd experienced during deep cover assignments. I'd spent months living with people who would have killed me without hesitation if they'd discovered my real identity. I'd been threatened by terrorists, stalked by foreign agents, and targeted by domestic extremist groups who'd put bounties on FBI agents' heads. A small-town HOA conspiracy was hardly going to rattle me. In fact, it was starting to intrigue me professionally. I began documenting everything with the methodical precision I'd used for federal investigations. Hidden cameras captured the late-night prowlers. GPS trackers, the kind you could buy online for keeping track of elderly relatives, ended up attached to the undercarriages of the surveillance vehicles. Every interaction was recorded, every citation photographed and catalogued. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just Margaret Whitmore on a power trip. This was an organized operation with multiple moving parts: fake security patrols, manufactured violations, intimidation tactics, and a network of complicit board members and residents. But the scope of it became truly clear on a Tuesday night in October. I was in my home office, reviewing the latest batch of citations I'd received, when I heard voices in my backyard. Through my window, I could see flashlight beams moving around my garden shed. 3 figures were examining my property, like crime scene investigators, taking pictures and measurements. I slipped out through my side door and positioned myself behind the oak tree at the corner of my lot. From there, I could hear their conversation clearly. "Margaret wants pictures of everything," one voice said. "She thinks he might be running some kind of business out of that shed." "What kind of business?" asked another voice. "Who cares? The point is to find something we can use to get the city involved. Code enforcement, fire department, whoever." The third voice belonged to someone older, more authoritative. "Just document everything. The electrical outlet he installed, the security cameras, that new fence gate. We'll find something that wasn't properly permitted." I recognized that third voice. Richard Carlyle, Margaret's deputy on the HOA board and a retired city code enforcement officer. He'd know exactly which violations would carry the most legal weight. As they worked, they talked about other residents. The Hendersons had been encouraged to relocate after Richard discovered that their back deck wasn't up to current building codes that had changed 3 years after the deck was built. The Johnsons were being targeted because their teenage son's friends parked on the street, creating what Margaret called an undesirable element in the community. "What about the new family on Maple Street?" one of the younger voices asked. "The Patels," Richard chuckled. "Margaret's already got plans for them. Apparently, their cooking smells are inconsistent with neighborhood standards. She's drafting a violation for aromatic disturbances." That's when I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about me. Margaret Whitmore was systematically targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of the right kind of resident for Willowbrook Estates. The elderly couple who might be harder to control, the young family whose teenage son brought diversity to the streets, the Indian family whose cultural traditions didn't align with her narrow definition of American suburban values. It was ethnic cleansing by bureaucracy. As the three men finished their inspection of my property, I followed them at a distance. They walked to the end of my street where 2 cars were parked, a dark sedan and a white pickup truck. But instead of leaving separately, they all got into the sedan together. I memorized the license plate and watched as they drove not toward the community exit, but deeper into the neighborhood, toward Margaret Whitmore's house on Elmwood Circle. The next morning, I conducted my own reconnaissance of Margaret's property. From the outside, it looked like every other house in the community. Pristine lawn, perfectly trimmed hedges, regulation mailbox. But there were details that suggested something more was going on. Security cameras at every corner of the house, far more than any normal homeowner would need. A separate garage building behind the main house that had been modified with additional electrical lines and what looked like soundproofing material around the windows. And most tellingly, a small parking area hidden behind landscaping where multiple vehicles could be staged without being visible from the street. This was a command center, not just a residence. That evening, I received a visit from Margaret herself. She arrived at my door with 2 of her security officers, the same heavy-set man I'd encountered before, plus a younger guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a military recruitment poster. Both were wearing official-looking uniforms with badges that said, "Willowbrook Community Enforcement." "Mr. Thompson," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false concern, "we need to discuss your continuing violations and your failure to cooperate with our reasonable requests." I opened the door wider and gestured for them to come in. "Of course. Please, let's sit down and talk this through." The security officers exchanged glances. They'd expected resistance, argument, maybe even aggression. Polite compliance threw them off their script. In my living room, Margaret sat in my recliner like she owned it, while her 2 enforcers flanked the doorway. It was a classic intimidation setup. Authority figure in the position of power, muscle visible but not directly threatening. "The board has reviewed your case," she began, "and we've determined that your pattern of violations and your confrontational attitude at meetings constitute a significant disruption to community harmony." "I see," I said, pulling out a notepad. "Could you be more specific about which violations you're referring to?" She blinked, not expecting me to take notes. All of them. The mailbox, the lawn, the unauthorized improvements. The mailbox that's now exactly the same height as everyone else's. The lawn that I've reseeded twice. The improvements that consist of a motion sensor light and a security camera. Her jaw tightened. The board has discretionary authority. Yes, you've mentioned that before. But I'm curious about something else. I looked up from my notepad. Are your security officers here licensed by the state? Because private security personnel are required to be certified and bonded if they're going to be conducting enforcement activities. The heavy-set officer shifted uncomfortably. We don't. You don't what? I asked innocently. Margaret cut him off. Mr. Thompson, you're not in a position to be making demands or asking questions. You're in violation of your HOA agreement, and if you don't come into compliance immediately, we'll be forced to take more serious action. Such as? Liens on your property, legal action, and if necessary, we have the authority to have you removed from the premises. There it was. The threat I'd been waiting for. Margaret Whitmore and her fake security force had just crossed the line from harassment into extortion and impersonation of law enforcement officers. I stood up slowly, and both officers tensed. But instead of showing aggression, I walked to my front window and adjusted the blinds. That's interesting, I said casually, because I've been doing some research, and I can't find any legal provision that gives an HOA the authority to have residents removed from their own property. In fact, that sounds like something only real law enforcement officers could do. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Are you questioning the authority of this board? I turned back to face her, and for just a moment, I let her see who I really was. No more confused homeowner. No more cooperative victim. Just 20 years of federal law enforcement experience looking back at her. I'm not questioning anything, I said quietly. I'm just observing and documenting, and wondering how many other residents have been subjected to this same kind of community outreach. She stood abruptly, her composure cracking for the first time. You're making a mistake, Mr. Thompson. This community has ways of dealing with residents who don't understand their place. I'm sure it does, I replied. But here's the thing, Margaret. May I call you Margaret? I understand my place perfectly. The question is, do you understand yours? After they left, I sat in my living room and smiled for the first time in months. They thought they were playing chess with a pawn. They didn't realize they'd just threatened a grandmaster. What they didn't know, the FBI never really lets go of its people, and I never really let go of my training. That night, after Margaret Whitmore's thinly veiled threats, I sat in my home office and did something I hadn't done in 18 months. I opened my secure laptop and logged into systems that most people didn't even know existed. The FBI had given me an honorable retirement, complete with full pension and benefits, but they'd also given me something else that Margaret and her fake police force couldn't possibly understand. Access. Not to classified information, I wasn't breaking any laws or violating any oaths, but to the kind of resources and networks that only come from 2 decades of federal service. My career hadn't been typical bureau work. While most agents spent their time on bank robberies, white-collar crime, and drug trafficking, I'd been part of a specialized unit that most people never heard about. We were the ones they sent in when local law enforcement was compromised, when criminal organizations had infiltrated legitimate institutions, and when conventional investigation methods weren't enough. I'd spent 3 years undercover with a militia group in Montana that was planning to bomb federal buildings. 2 years infiltrating a human trafficking ring that operated through a network of legitimate businesses across 5 states. 4 years working counterintelligence against foreign nationals who were using community organizations as cover for espionage. Operations. The skills I'd developed weren't just about gathering evidence or making arrests. They were about understanding how criminal organizations think, how they recruit and maintain loyalty, and most importantly, how they hide in plain sight by mimicking legitimate authority. Margaret Whitmore's HOA operation was textbook organized crime, just on a smaller scale than I was used to dealing with. I pulled up my contact list, not the one on my regular phone, but the encrypted directory that contained 2 decades worth of professional relationships, agents who owed me favors, analysts who specialized in financial crimes, technical specialists who could trace digital footprints that criminals thought they'd erased. My first call was to Janet Rodriguez, a forensic accountant who'd helped me unravel money laundering schemes during my trafficking investigations. She was now in private practice, doing consulting work for law firms and insurance companies. "Marcus Thompson," she said when she answered, her voice warm with genuine affection. "I was wondering when you'd get bored with retirement and call me for a favor." "Not bored," I replied. "Just dealing with a situation that could use your particular expertise." I explained the HOA harassment campaign, focusing on the financial aspects, the escalating fines, the mysterious, updated regulations, the private security contractors. "Small-scale extortion with a bureaucratic front," Janet said. "I've seen similar operations. Usually, there's a money trail that leads to shell companies and kickback schemes. Send me whatever financial records you can get, and I'll see what patterns emerge." My second call was to David Park, a digital forensics expert who'd worked with me on cases involving criminal organizations that used technology to coordinate their operations. He'd left the bureau 5 years ago to start his own cybersecurity firm. "You know," he said, after I explained the situation, "this sounds like a perfect test case for some new surveillance detection software I've been developing. Remote monitoring, pattern analysis, communication intercepts, all completely legal if it's being used to investigate suspected criminal activity on your own property." Suspected criminal activity? Impersonation of law enforcement officers, extortion, harassment, trespassing sounds like probable cause to me, especially if you're documenting it for potential legal action. My third call was the most important one. Special Agent Sarah Chen, my former partner and one of the few people who knew exactly what kind of operations I'd been involved in before my retirement. "Let me guess," she said, before I could explain why I was calling. "You've stumbled into something that looks like organized crime. But everyone thinks you're just a paranoid retiree, and you need someone with active credentials to take a look." "Something like that." "Marcus, you know I can't officially investigate an HOA dispute." "I'm not asking for an official investigation. I'm asking for advice from someone who knows how these things work." There was a pause. Sarah had been with me in Montana when we'd taken down the militia group. She'd seen how criminal organizations could hide behind legitimate-seeming institutions and how they could use fear and intimidation to control entire communities. "Send me what you have," she said finally. "If there's something worth looking at, I'll find a way to look at it." Over the next week, I began building a case file that would have made my old supervisors proud. Every photograph, every recording, every piece of correspondence was cataloged and cross-referenced. I created timelines showing the escalation of harassment tactics. I mapped the network of relationships between Margaret Whitmore, her board members, and the various security contractors she employed. Most importantly, I started following the money. HOA finances are supposed to be transparent to residents, but Willowbrook Estates' financial records were mysteriously difficult to obtain. When I requested copies of the annual budget and expense reports, I was told they were under review by the accounting firm and would be available in the coming months. But David Park's surveillance software was starting to paint a picture of the operation's scope. The hidden cameras I'd installed around my property were capturing the movements of Margaret's security team, and the pattern analysis showed that their activities went far beyond simple harassment. They were conducting systematic surveillance of multiple residents, timing their movements, cataloging their habits, and identifying vulnerabilities. The elderly Henderson couple had been targeted right after Mrs. Henderson had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. information that should have been private medical data. The Johnson family was being harassed intensively right after their teenage son had been arrested for underage drinking. Again, information that shouldn't have been available to an HOA. Someone was feeding Margaret Whitmore intelligence about residents' private lives, and she was using it to identify who to target and when to strike. Janet Rodriguez's financial analysis revealed even more troubling patterns. The HOA's operating expenses had increased by 300% over the past 2 years, with most of the additional money going to security services and community compliance contractors. But when she tried to trace these payments, they led to a network of shell companies and limited liability corporations that existed only on paper. "This is classic money laundering," Janet told me during one of our encrypted video calls. "They're taking HOA dues and assessment fees, legitimate community funds, and funneling them through fake companies back to the board members and their associates. The harassment campaign isn't just about control. It's about generating revenue through fines and forced compliance costs. But the most damning evidence came from David's communication intercepts. Margaret Whitmore and her security team were using a private messaging app to coordinate their activities, thinking that it was encrypted and secure. What they didn't know was that David's software could detect the metadata signatures of these communications and track the network of devices that were sending and receiving them. The messages revealed the true scope of their operation. They were targeting specific types of residents: elderly homeowners who might be vulnerable to financial pressure, families with teenagers who could be portrayed as problematic, and anyone whose race, ethnicity, or lifestyle didn't match Margaret's vision of proper suburban demographics. But there was something else in the communications that sent a chill through me. References to the next phase and expanding to other communities. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just running a scam in Willowbrook Estates. She was using it as a prototype for a much larger operation. That's when I realized that this had stopped being personal and had become something much more serious. Margaret and her team weren't just running a local extortion scheme. They were developing a model for using HOA governance as a tool for systematic discrimination and financial fraud. And they were planning to export it. On a Thursday evening in November, I got the call I'd been expecting. Margaret Whitmore's voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "Mr. Thompson, the board has made its final decision regarding your status in this community. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take action to have you removed." "On what legal basis?" I asked. "Violation of community standards, failure to comply with board directives, and creation of a hostile environment for other residents. The board has the authority to revoke your residency privileges." "Actually, Margaret, the board doesn't have that authority. HOAs can place liens on properties, but they can't force residents to vacate their own homes. That would require a court order, which would require actual evidence of actual legal violations." There was a pause. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're underestimating the situation you're in." "No," I said quietly. "I think you're underestimating the situation you're in." After I hung up, I made one more call. This one was to my old friend Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hansen, a military police officer I'd worked with on Joint Task Force operations. He was now retired but still had connections throughout law enforcement and military security communities. "Mike," I said when he answered, "I need you to make some calls. There's something happening in my neighborhood that's about to require official attention." The next morning, I started preparing for war. Not the kind of war that involved weapons or violence, but the kind that I'd been trained to fight for 20 years. Information warfare, conducted with patience, precision, and overwhelming evidence, Margaret Whitmore thought. She was dealing with an isolated retiree who could be intimidated into submission. She was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent 2 decades learning how to dismantle criminal organizations from the inside. out. And the beautiful thing about criminal organizations is that once they start making threats, they inevitably start making mistakes. I just had to be ready to catch them when they did. You never fight a syndicate alone. But when the right people hear your story, the pieces start moving. The morning after Margaret's ultimatum, I started making moves I hadn't made since my bureau days, building a network of assets and turning their own tactics against them. My first ally was closer than I'd expected. I was checking my mail when Tom Rodriguez approached from across the street. He was a retired police detective who'd moved into Willowbrook Estates about the same time I had, and we'd exchanged pleasantries over the months, but never really talked. He was Hispanic, maybe 60, with the careful walk of someone who'd spent decades watching for threats. "Marcus," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. "We need to talk, but not here." 20 minutes later, we were sitting in his garage with the door closed. Tom had converted half of it into a workshop, but I could see the tactical mindset in how it was organized. Clear sightlines to both entrances, no windows that could be observed from outside, and what looked like a police scanner discreetly mounted behind his workbench. "Those aren't real cops," he said without preamble. "I know. You know?" He studied my face. "Most people wouldn't know. Their uniforms are decent copies, and they've got the swagger down. But their positioning is all wrong. Their equipment doesn't match, and they're carrying tasers like they've never been trained on them." I nodded. "Plus, their badges are too shiny, and their radio procedures are non-existent." Tom's eyes narrowed. "You sound like you know what you're talking about." 20 years FBI, I said. "Retired 18 months ago." He leaned back in his chair. "Well, that explains a lot. I was wondering why they seem so frustrated with you. Most people crack under this kind of pressure." "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" Tom walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting their activities since they started targeting you. But it's not just you, Marcus. They've run at least 6 families out of this neighborhood in the past 2 years. He spread photos across his workbench. License plates, faces, vehicles, all taken with the telephoto lens of someone who knew how to conduct surveillance without being detected. "The Hendersons were first," he continued. "Nice elderly couple, been here since the community was built. Margaret started hitting them with violations for everything. Their rose bushes were too tall, their porch light was the wrong color, their newspaper box was supposedly blocking pedestrian traffic. When they tried to fight it, her security goons started showing up at their door at all hours, claiming to be conducting compliance checks. And they moved, sold for $30,000 under market value just to get out. Mrs. Henderson told my wife they were afraid to stay in their own house." Tom flipped to another set of photos. The Johnsons were next. Young black family, 2 kids. Margaret claimed their teenage son was attracting an undesirable element because his friends would visit. Then her fake cops started pulling the kid over every time he drove through the neighborhood, claiming they had reports of suspicious activity. That's not legal. Of course it's not legal, but these people don't know that. And even if they did, who are they going to complain to? The real police? Margaret's got connections in the department through her ex-husband. The city council? Half of them live in HOA communities and don't want to set precedents that might limit their own board powers. I studied the photos more carefully. You said 6 families? The Patels, Margaret claimed their cooking smells were a nuisance and got the city to investigate them for running an unlicensed restaurant. The Williams family, elderly black couple who'd been here for 15 years. Margaret's team found a technicality with their fence permit and threatened them with thousands in fines. The Chen family. She claimed their decorative garden violated cultural appropriateness standards, whatever the hell that means. And the 6th? Tom's expression darkened. The Kowalskis. Polish immigrants. Both worked double shifts to afford a house here. Margaret decided their English wasn't good enough for them to properly participate in community governance. Her security team started showing up when they weren't home, claiming they were investigating reports of unauthorized occupancy. The pattern was even clearer now. Margaret wasn't just running a financial scam. She was using HOA authority to conduct ethnic cleansing, one family at a time. "Why haven't you reported this?" I asked. "To who?" I tried talking to some of the other residents, but most of them are either scared or complicit. The few who might help are afraid of becoming targets themselves. Tom walked to another cabinet and pulled out a different folder. "But there is someone else who's been paying attention." He handed me a business card. Jennifer Walsh, investigative reporter, Metro Herald. "She's been working on a story about HOA abuse across the metro area," Tom explained. "I reached out to her a few months ago, sent her some of my documentation. She's interested, but she needs more sources. People willing to go on record, and most victims just want to move on with their lives. Can't say I blame them. I considered this. Media attention could be useful, but it could also alert Margaret that her operation was under scrutiny before I was ready to move against her." "There's someone else," Tom continued. "Amy Chen, no relation to the family that got driven out. She's a lawyer who lives over on Oak Street. Civil rights attorney, specializes in housing discrimination. She's been watching what's happening here, and she's not happy about it." That afternoon, I found myself in Amy Chen's home office, looking at legal documents that made my blood boil. Amy was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and intense, with the kind of focused energy I recognized from federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights cases. "What Margaret Whitmore is doing isn't just unethical," Amy said, spreading contracts and legal filings across her desk. "It's criminal. Civil rights violations, extortion, impersonation of law enforcement officers, fraud. I could file charges under a dozen different statutes. Why haven't you?" "Evidence. I can prove the pattern of discrimination, but I need documentation of the specific tactics they're using. I need recordings of threats, financial records showing the money laundering, communications between Margaret and her security team." I smiled. "I might be able to help with that." Amy's eyes lit up. "You've been documenting everything?" "Everything. Video, audio, financial analysis, communication intercepts. 2 decades of federal training has its advantages. This is exactly what I need." "But Marcus, there's something else you should know." Amy pulled out a legal brief with the state attorney general's letterhead. "I've been in contact with the AG's office about HOA abuse statewide. There are similar operations in at least 4 other communities, all following the same playbook. This isn't just about Willowbrook Estates." That confirmed what I'd seen in the intercepted communications. Margaret's operation was part of something larger. "Here's what I propose," Amy continued. "We coordinate our approach. You gather the evidence, I build the legal case, and when we're ready, we move against all of them simultaneously. Not just Margaret and her security team, but the entire network." Our informal alliance grew over the next week. Tom provided surveillance and tactical support. His detective background made him invaluable for understanding how criminal organizations operate at street level. Amy handled the legal strategy and maintained contact with state authorities. I coordinated intelligence gathering and provided the technical resources that my FBI connections could offer. We met every few days in different locations. Tom's garage, Amy's office, sometimes in the back corner of a coffee shop 2 towns over. Each meeting felt like the old days, building a case against a criminal organization, identifying key players, mapping their vulnerabilities. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lisa Martinez was 19 years old, the daughter of a family that had been driven out of Willowbrook Estates the previous year. She contacted Amy through a civil rights hotline, asking if there was anything that could be done about what had happened to her parents. "They destroyed my family," Lisa told us during a secure video call. "My parents saved for 15 years to buy a house in that neighborhood. They thought it would be safe. that the HOA would protect property values and keep the community nice. Lisa's parents were both immigrants from El Salvador, hard-working people who'd started a small landscaping business. Margaret had targeted them by claiming their work truck was commercial activity that violated residential zoning. When they tried to park it off-site, she claimed the chemicals and equipment they stored in their garage were environmental hazards. But here's the thing, Lisa continued. My dad is really careful about keeping records. He's got documentation of every conversation, every fine, every threat. And he recorded some of the meetings with Margaret's security guys. Amy and I exchanged glances. Victims who fought back and documented their harassment were exactly what we needed. There's more, Lisa said. My mom cleaned houses for some of the other residents before we moved. She heard things. Margaret and her board members talking about which families to target next, how to manufacture violations, even discussions about splitting the money they were making from fines and forced buyouts. Your mother would be willing to testify? Amy asked. She's terrified, but she's also angry. If there's a way to stop Margaret from doing this to other families, she'll help. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing our expanding case file. We now had documentation from multiple victims, financial evidence of fraud and money laundering, recordings of threats and intimidation, and a network of allies with the skills and motivation to see this through. But Margaret was escalating too. The surveillance of my house had increased, and Tom had spotted her security team conducting reconnaissance of Amy's neighborhood and following her to her office. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 72 hours is up. Time to leave. I screenshot the message and added it to our evidence file. Then I sent a group text to Tom and Amy. They're making their move. Time to make ours. The next morning, I woke up to find my car windows smashed and my mailbox destroyed. Spray-painted on my driveway in red letters were the words, "Last warning." I took photos, documented everything, and called Tom. They're getting desperate, he said when he arrived. This is good news. Good news? Desperate criminals make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, Tom grinned grimly. That's when we take them down. That afternoon, Margaret Whitmore made her biggest mistake yet. She decided to come for me personally. I let them believe I was cornered. But cornered animals aren't always prey. They're predators waiting for the right moment. Margaret's escalation came exactly as I'd predicted. Criminal organizations always follow the same pattern. Start with bureaucratic pressure, escalate to psychological intimidation, and when those fail, resort to direct threats and violence. It's as predictable as clockwork once you understand the psychology behind it. The morning after they vandalized my car, I found a notice taped to my front door. Official-looking letterhead, legal language, stamped with what appeared to be a court seal. It claimed that the Willowbrook Estates Community Authority had obtained an T-2T emergency removal order, and that I had 24 hours to vacate my property or face immediate enforcement. Action. It was completely fraudulent, of course. There's no such thing as a community authority with power to issue removal orders, and real court documents don't get taped to doors like eviction notices. But it looked convincing enough to fool most people, and that was the point. I called Amy Chen immediately. They're moving to the end game, she said, after I read her the fake legal notice. This is perfect. They've just committed mail fraud, impersonation of court officials, and attempted extortion under color of law. Federal charges, Marcus. This isn't just civil rights violations anymore. How long do you need? Give me 2 days to coordinate with the state AG and get everything in place. Can you hold them off that long? I smiled. I can hold them off for as long as necessary. That afternoon, I began implementing something I called operational theater. For 20 years, I'd used controlled scenarios to gather evidence and expose criminal behavior. The key was creating situations where the targets would reveal themselves while believing they were in control. First, I called Margaret directly. I got your notice, I said, making my voice sound defeated and resigned. I need more time. Time for what? Her voice was sharp with anticipated victory. To pack, to arrange moving, to find somewhere else to go. 24 hours isn't enough. There was a pause. She was savoring this moment. The board might be willing to extend the deadline if you're prepared to cooperate fully. What does that mean? It means you acknowledge that you've been disruptive to this community, you apologize publicly for your behavior, and you commit to leaving voluntarily within 1 week. And if I do that, no more. Enforcement actions. Mr. Thompson, if you cooperate, this can all be resolved peacefully. Perfect. She just admitted on a recorded line that she was using enforcement actions to coerce my compliance. Textbook extortion. I need to think about it, I said. Can I have until tomorrow evening to decide? You have until tomorrow at 6 p.m. After that, we implement the removal order. After I hung up, I sent encrypted messages to my network. Tom would coordinate surveillance of all the key players. Amy would have legal papers ready to file the moment Margaret crossed the final line. My FBI contacts would be standing by with federal warrants if necessary. But most importantly, I started preparing my house. David Park's surveillance equipment was already in place, but now I added layers. Micro cameras in every room, audio recording devices that could capture conversations from adjacent properties, motion sensors that would alert me to any approach from any direction. I also made some more visible preparations, the kind that would make Margaret's security team think I was fortifying against them. I installed additional exterior lighting, reinforced my front and back doors with security bars, and made sure that anyone watching would see me checking windows and adjusting locks. I wanted them to believe I was scared, that I was turning my house into a fortress because I felt trapped and desperate. The beauty of operational theater is that people see what they expect to see. Margaret expected me to be afraid, so every defensive measure I took would be interpreted as evidence of fear rather than preparation. That evening, Tom called with intelligence updates. Margaret's got a full operation planned for tomorrow, he said. I've identified at least 6 vehicles staging in different locations around the neighborhood. Her security team has been reinforced with additional personnel. Looks like she brought in people from outside the community. What kind of people? Ex-cons, mostly. I ran the plates through my old contacts at the department. 2 of them have previous arrests for intimidation and assault. One's got a conviction for impersonating a police officer. This was getting better by the minute. Margaret was building a RICO case against herself. There's more, Tom continued. Amy intercepted communications between Margaret and someone she's calling the coordinator. Sounds like this operation is being directed from outside Willowbrook Estates. Someone higher up the chain? That's what it sounds like. Amy thinks Margaret is part of a larger network that's been implementing this same strategy in multiple communities. The next day, I played my role perfectly. I made several trips to my car, loading boxes and suitcases in full view of the surveillance teams. I called a moving company from a phone I knew they were monitoring and scheduled an estimate for the following week. To anyone watching, I looked like a defeated man preparing to surrender. At 4 p.m., I received a call from Margaret. Have you made your decision, Mr. Thompson? I'll cooperate, I said, injecting just the right amount of resignation into my voice. I'll make the public apology and leave within the week. Excellent. The board will meet tomorrow morning to accept your apology and finalize the arrangement. Actually, I said, I was hoping we could handle this tonight. I'd rather get it over with. Could you and the board come by my house around 7? I'll make the apology then, and we can sign whatever paperwork is needed. There was a pause while she considered this. She was probably wondering if it was some kind of trap, but her ego was too big to pass up the opportunity to accept my surrender in person. Very well. The board will be there at 7 o'clock sharp. At 6:30 p.m., as the sun was setting, I positioned myself at my front window and watched Margaret's small army assemble. 3 cars parked on my street, 2 more around the corner. Men in fake police uniforms took positions around my house, while Margaret and 3 board members approached my front door. Everything was being recorded from multiple angles. Every word would be captured. Every threat would be documented. This was the moment I'd been building toward for months. I opened the door before they could knock, stepping aside to let them enter. Margaret walked in like she was claiming conquered territory, followed by Richard Carlisle and 2 other board members I recognized from community meetings. Behind them, I could see her security team spreading out across my front yard, their hands resting on tasers and zip-tie handcuffs. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret said, settling into my living room chair like she owned it, "I'm pleased that you've decided to be reasonable." "I have a prepared statement," I said, pulling out a piece of paper. "Would you like me to read it now?" "Please proceed." I cleared my throat and began to read. "I, Marcus Thompson, want to acknowledge my disruptive behavior in the Willowbrook Estates community and apologize to the board and residents for any inconvenience I may have caused." Margaret smiled triumphantly. Richard Carlisle was taking notes, probably planning to use my statement in future intimidation campaigns against other residents. I continued. "However, I also want to acknowledge something else." I looked up from the paper. "I want to acknowledge that I've spent the past 6 months documenting every aspect of your criminal enterprise." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Margaret's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said I've been documenting your criminal enterprise. The fraud, the extortion, the impersonation of law enforcement officers, the civil rights violations, the money laundering. All of it." Richard started to stand. "Now wait just a minute." "Sit down, Richard." My voice carried the authority of 2 decades in federal law enforcement. "All of you, sit down and listen very carefully." Margaret's face was turning red. "You can't." "I can, and I have. Every conversation has been recorded. Every financial transaction has been traced. Every fake citation, every fraudulent legal document, every threat made by your security team. It's all been documented and provided to state and federal authorities." The board members were looking at each other with growing panic, but Margaret was still trying to maintain control. "You're bluffing," she said. "You can't prove anything." "Margaret," I said quietly, "I spent 20 years bringing down criminal organizations for the FBI. You're running a small-time extortion racket with delusions of grandeur. This isn't even challenging." That's when I heard the sound that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. The low rumble of multiple vehicles pulling up outside my house. Through the window, we could all see the unmarked SUVs surrounding the property, the tactical teams deploying, the federal agents in bulletproof vests approaching the front door. Margaret turned pale. "This isn't possible." "Actually," I said, "it's inevitable. You see, when you threaten a federal agent, even a retired one, you get the attention of people who take that very personally." The front door opened, and Special Agent Sarah Chen walked in, followed by a team of FBI agents and state investigators. "Marcus," Sarah said professionally, "thank you for your cooperation in this matter." I nodded toward Margaret and her board. "Special Agent Chen, I'd like you to meet Margaret Whitmore and her associates. I believe you'll find them very interesting to talk to." As the agents began reading Miranda rights to the stunned board members, I walked to my front door and looked out at Margaret's security team. They were standing frozen in my yard, hands raised, surrounded by real federal agents with real badges and real authority. "You wanted to arrest me?" I called out to them. "You just arrested yourselves." The last thing I heard as they loaded Margaret into the back of a federal vehicle was her voice, high and desperate. "This isn't over. You can't destroy everything we've built." But it was over, and I had destroyed everything they'd built, because that's what happens when you mistake a federal predator for suburban prey. When the real badges arrived, the fake ones crumbled like paper. The scene outside my house looked like something from a crime drama. Federal agents in tactical gear, state investigators with evidence boxes, and Margaret Whitmore's security team sitting on my curb in zip-tie handcuffs, looking nothing like the intimidating force they'd pretended to be just hours before. Sarah Chen coordinated the operation with the precision I remembered from our days working together. While her team processed Margaret and the board members, state investigators began executing search warrants on their homes and the community center where they'd been running their operation. But the most satisfying moment came when the neighbors started emerging from their houses. Word spread quickly through Willowbrook Estates that something major was happening at the Thompson house. People who'd been hiding behind their curtains for months, afraid to challenge the HOA's authority, suddenly found the courage to step outside and watch their tormentors being led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Patterson from down the street was the first to approach. She was an elderly widow who'd received dozens of harassment citations over the past year. Her crime had been planting flowers that Margaret deemed inconsistent with community aesthetics. "Mr. Thompson," she said, tears streaming down her face, "I can't believe this is really happening. We thought they were untouchable." Tom Rodriguez emerged from the crowd of onlookers, grinning widely. "Marcus, you beautiful bastard! You actually did it." Amy Chen arrived just as the last of Margaret's security team was being loaded into transport vehicles. She was carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the satisfied expression of a prosecutor who'd just seen months of preparation pay off. "How many charges are we looking at?" I asked her. "For Margaret personally? Racketeering, extortion, civil rights violations, mail fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, money laundering, and about a dozen state-level crimes. She's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. And the others? The board members are facing conspiracy charges and fraud. The security team, impersonation of officers, assault, intimidation, extortion. Even the low-level guys are looking at serious prison time." Sarah Chen joined our conversation, pulling out her notebook. "Marcus, I need you to walk me through how extensive this network really is. From what we're seeing in the preliminary evidence, this operation was connected to similar schemes in at least 6 other communities." Over the next hour, as crime scene technicians processed evidence and federal agents interviewed neighbors, the full scope of Margaret's criminal enterprise began to emerge. The coordinator that Tom had heard about in the intercepted communications was a man named Vincent Carrera, a former real estate developer who'd created a consulting company that specialized in community management solutions. His business model was elegant in its criminality. Identify affluent suburban communities with weak HOA governance, install complicit board members, and systematically drive out residents who didn't fit the desired demographic profile. The financial structure was sophisticated. Carrera's company would provide security services and compliance management to HOAs for inflated fees, then use a network of shell companies to launder the money back to the conspirators. The forced sales of harassed residents' homes created additional revenue streams through insider real estate deals. "It's organized crime for the suburban era," Sarah explained. "Instead of controlling neighborhoods through violence and drugs, they control them through bureaucracy and fake legal authority. But what made the scheme particularly insidious was how it exploited legitimate concerns about property values and community standards. Many residents had supported the aggressive enforcement policies because they believed it would protect their investments and maintain neighborhood quality." Richard Carlyle, what is it to foreign France 100 Margaret's deputy, was the first to break during questioning. Faced with decades in federal prison, he provided detailed information about the network's operations, including a list of other communities where similar schemes were being implemented. "He's giving us everything," Sarah told me, as we watched the last evidence boxes being loaded into federal vehicles. Names, locations, financial records, communication logs. This is going to be the largest suburban fraud prosecution in the state's history. As the federal convoy pulled away, taking Margaret and her conspirators to their first night in federal custody, the neighborhood began to come alive in a way I hadn't seen since I'd moved here. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months, afraid that any social gathering might be deemed a violation by the HOA, suddenly found themselves talking freely in the street. People were laughing, crying, and sharing stories about the harassment they'd endured. Lisa Martinez, the young woman whose family had been driven out of the community, arrived just as the last federal vehicle was leaving. She'd driven 3 hours to be here, bringing her parents with her. "Is it really over?" her father asked me in heavily accented English. "It's over," I confirmed. "And there's going to be justice for what they did to your family." Amy Chen was already discussing the civil rights lawsuit that would follow the criminal prosecutions. Families who'd been forced from their homes would be compensated. The HOA's fraudulent fines would be reversed. The community's governance structure would be rebuilt from the ground up, with real oversight and accountability. But beyond the legal remedies, something more important was happening in the neighborhood that night. People were connecting with each other as neighbors rather than potential HOA violations. The Martinez family was invited to multiple homes for dinner. Mrs. Patterson was finally able to show off the flower garden she'd been forced to destroy months earlier. The few remaining families of color in the neighborhood found themselves surrounded by supporters rather than isolated by suspicion. "You know what the best part of this is?" Tom Rodriguez said, as we stood on my front porch, watching impromptu block parties forming up and down the street. "What's that?" Margaret always claimed she was protecting community values. But look around. This is what real community values look like. People helping each other, supporting each other, standing up for each other. He was right. Margaret Whitmore had spent 2 years trying to create her vision of a perfect community through fear and intimidation. But in one night, the neighbors of Willowbrook Estates had created something genuinely perfect. A community based on mutual respect and shared humanity. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen. "Media's going to want to interview you. You ready to be famous?" I typed back. "Only if it helps prevent this from happening somewhere else." The next morning, I woke up to find news vans lined up on my street. The story was already spreading. Retired FBI agent exposes suburban crime ring. Fake police terrorize neighborhood. HOA fraud scheme targets minorities. But the headline that made me smile the most was in the local community newspaper. "Neighbors unite to reclaim their community." During my interview with the lead FBI agent handling the case, I learned that our investigation had already led to raids in 4 other states. Vincent Carrera's community management network was being dismantled piece by piece, with dozens of arrests and hundreds of victims finally getting justice. "How did you know it would work?" the agent asked me. "The whole operation, drawing them out, getting them to commit federal crimes on camera, coordinating with multiple agencies." I thought about that for a moment. I didn't know it would work, but I knew that criminal organizations always make the same mistakes. They get comfortable with their power, they underestimate their victims, and they always escalate beyond what they can legally defend. And you were willing to gamble your safety on that? It wasn't really a gamble. I had 20 years of experience, a team of professionals, and documented evidence of ongoing crimes. But most importantly, I had something Margaret Whitmore never understood, which was, I had a community worth fighting for. 3 months later, I stood in my backyard, tending to the garden that Margaret had once tried to cite me for. The plants were thriving. My neighbors stopped by regularly to chat and share coffee, and for the first time since I'd moved to Willowbrook Estates, it truly felt like home. Margaret Whitmore was serving the first year of what would likely be a 25-year federal sentence. Vincent Carrera and his network were awaiting trial on charges that could put them away for life. The fake security officers were learning what real prison authority looked like. But the best revenge wasn't their punishment. It was the transformation of our community. The new HOA board was elected democratically, with full transparency and accountability measures. The community garden that Mrs. Patterson had always wanted was finally approved and flourishing. The Martinez family had moved back into the house they'd been forced to sell, purchased with proceeds from the civil settlement. And every evening at sunset, I would sit on my front porch and watch the neighborhood kids riding their bikes, neighbors walking their dogs, and families gathering for barbecues in their backyards. It was exactly the kind of community I'd wanted when I retired from the FBI. Peaceful, diverse, and safe. The only difference was that now I knew it was worth fighting to protect. When the dust settled, the community finally saw who had been protecting them all along. 6 months after the arrests, I was asked to speak at the National Association of Community Managers Conference about preventing HOA fraud and abuse. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of property managers and board members, I realized that our small neighborhood battle had become something much larger. The Willowbrook Estates case wasn't unusual because it was criminal, I told the audience. It was unusual because it was exposed. Similar operations are happening in communities across the country, hiding behind the legitimate authority that homeowners associations wield over residents' lives. In the months following Margaret's arrest, federal authorities had identified and shut down similar schemes in 12 states. The Vincent Carrera network alone had affected over 400 families, with financial damages exceeding $50 million, but the real cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the destruction of communities. Back in Willowbrook Estates, the healing process was ongoing but remarkable. The community center that had once been Margaret's command post was now used for neighborhood movie nights, art classes, and volunteer coordination meetings. The board meetings that had once been exercises in intimidation were now genuine forums for residents to discuss shared concerns and solutions. Tom Rodriguez had been elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of transparency and accountability. His first official act was to publish all financial records online and establish an ombudsman system for residents who felt they were being treated unfairly. Amy Chen had filed a class action lawsuit that resulted in $15 million in settlements for affected families. More importantly, it had established legal precedents that made it harder for other communities to engage in similar discrimination schemes. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between neighbors. The Patel family, who'd been harassed for their aromatic disturbances, now hosted monthly cultural dinner parties that were among the most popular community events. Mrs. Patterson's flower garden had become a neighborhood gathering place where children played and adults shared conversation over her fence. The Martinez family had not only moved back, but had become community leaders, with their teenage son serving on the newly created Youth Advisory Committee and their landscaping business providing services to neighbors who chose to hire them. What we learned, Tom said during one of our regular coffee conversations, is that diversity isn't a threat to community values, it is a community value. The criminal trials had been swift and decisive. Margaret Whitmore pled guilty to racketeering and conspiracy charges in exchange for a 20-year sentence. Vincent Carrera was convicted on all counts and received life in prison. The various security contractors and board members received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, but the most satisfying moment of the legal proceedings came during Margaret's sentencing hearing. Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense federal judge with 30 years of experience, looked down at Margaret from the bench and delivered a statement that was later quoted in law enforcement training materials. Ms. Whitmore, you perverted the legitimate function of community governance to serve your own prejudices and financial interests. You used fear and intimidation to destroy families and neighborhoods. You corrupted the very concept of civic responsibility. The sentence I'm imposing today reflects not just your crimes, but the breach of trust you committed against every community that depends on good faith governance. Margaret's final words before being led away were typical. I was just trying to maintain standards. These people didn't belong here anyway. Even facing 2 decades in federal prison, she couldn't acknowledge what she'd really done. The ripple effects of our case continued to spread. The FBI created a new task force focused on HOA fraud and civil rights violations. State legislators introduced bills requiring oversight of HOA enforcement activities. Legal aid organizations developed resources to help communities identify and report abuse. Most importantly, neighborhoods that had been suffering in silence began to find their voices. I received hundreds of emails from residents across the country who'd recognized similar patterns in their own communities. Some were dealing with financial schemes like Margaret's. Others faced more subtle forms of discrimination and intimidation. All of them had felt powerless to fight back against seemingly legitimate authority. Working with Amy Chen, we developed what became known as the Willowbrook Protocol, a systematic approach for communities to identify, document, and report HOA abuse. It included legal resources, evidence-gathering techniques, and networking tools to help isolated residents find allies and support. The key insight, Amy explained during one of our training seminars, is that these operations depend on victims feeling isolated and powerless. Once residents understand they're not alone and they have legal recourse, these schemes collapse quickly. A year after the arrests, the Willowbrook Estates community decided to commemorate what we'd been through with an annual Community Justice Day. It wasn't a celebration of the criminal prosecutions, it was a celebration of neighbors supporting neighbors, of diverse voices being heard, and of the courage it takes to stand up to corruption. The day included workshops on civic engagement, presentations by civil rights organizations, and community service projects. But the heart of it was simply neighbors spending time together, sharing stories, and strengthening the bonds that make a community resilient against future threats. During the first Community Justice Day, I was asked to give a brief speech. Standing in the same community center where Margaret had once held her authoritarian court, I looked out at families of every background, age, and economic level, the kind of diverse, vibrant community that she'd tried to destroy. A year ago, I said, we learned that our community was under attack by people who used fake authority to spread fear and division. But we also learned something more important. When neighbors stand together, when we support each other and refuse to be intimidated, no criminal organization can destroy what we've built together. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but more energetic than ever, raised her hand from the audience. Mr. Thompson, what you did took tremendous courage. How do we make sure other communities know they can fight back too? By remembering that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms, I replied. It starts in neighborhoods like ours, with neighbors who refuse to let fear silence them. 2 years later, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Special Agent Chen was on the line with news. Marcus, we just wrapped up the final prosecution in the Carrera network. 43 defendants convicted, over $100 million recovered for victims, and new federal guidelines for investigating HOA fraud cases. Any idea how many families were affected in total? Over 800 families across 15 states. Your willingness to fight back probably saved hundreds of others from going through what you experienced. That evening, I sat on my front porch as the sun set over Willowbrook Estates. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of children playing, neighbors chatting over fences, and families enjoying barbecues in their backyards. It was the kind of scene that Norman Rockwell might have painted, but with a richness and diversity that his era could never have imagined. Tom Rodriguez walked over from across the street, carrying 2 bottles of beer. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I replied. 2 years ago, this neighborhood was dying. Fear, suspicion, families being driven out. Now look at it. You know what I think the real victory was? Tom asked. "What's that?" Tom asked. "What's that?" It wasn't catching Margaret and her crew. It was proving that regular people can stand up to organized corruption and win. That communities can protect themselves without sacrificing their values. He was right. The criminal prosecutions had been satisfying, but they were just the beginning. The real victory was in the transformation of how our neighbors saw themselves and each other. Mrs. Patterson had become a community activist, serving on the city's Elder Abuse Prevention Committee. The Martinez family had not only rebuilt their lives, but had started a non-profit organization helping other immigrant families navigate HOA disputes. Lisa Martinez had graduated from law school and was now working with Amy Chen's firm, specializing in civil rights cases. The ripple effects continued to spread. The Willowbrook Protocol had been adopted by community organizations in over 20 states. Federal training programs for law enforcement now included modules on identifying HOA fraud schemes. State bar associations offered continuing education credits for attorneys who wanted to learn about representing communities facing organized harassment. But perhaps the most important change was in the hundreds of communities where residents had found the courage to challenge suspicious HOA activities before they could escalate into full criminal enterprises. "You know," Tom continued, "I used to think retirement meant stepping back from the fight, just enjoying peace and quiet after decades of dealing with criminals. And now I think retirement means choosing which fights are worth having. And protecting your community. That's always worth fighting for." As we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood kids chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, I reflected on the lessons of the past 2 years. I'd learned that criminal organizations could hide in the most mundane institutions, even suburban homeowners associations. But I'd also learned that communities have more power than they realize to protect themselves. I'd learned that seemingly legitimate authority could be used as a weapon against innocent people. But I'd also learned that when that authority is challenged by people who understand how systems really work, it crumbles quickly. Most importantly, I'd learned that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it's about creating conditions where wrong can't flourish in the first place. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy Chen. "Just got word that the Department of Justice is using our case as the model for a new nationwide initiative on community fraud prevention. Congratulations, Marcus. You've officially changed federal policy." I typed back, "We changed federal policy. This was never a one-man operation." Another message came in, this one from Sarah Chen. "Saw the news about the DOJ initiative. Proud to have worked with you on this. When are you coming out of retirement to consult on more cases?" I looked around at my neighborhood. Truly peaceful now, but not the artificial peace of intimidation and fear that Margaret had tried to impose. This was the organic peace that comes from neighbors who trust each other, who look out for each other, and who aren't afraid to speak up when something's wrong. I typed back to Sarah, "I'm not retired from protecting my community. I'm just doing it from my front porch now." As Tom headed home and the streetlights began to flicker on, I remained on my porch for a while longer. The night air was warm, filled with the sounds of a neighborhood that was truly alive. Distant laughter from backyard gatherings, the gentle hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing by with music playing softly. This was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not just justice for the crimes that had been committed, but the restoration of what a community could be when it was built on mutual respect instead of fear. Margaret Whitmore had tried to create her vision of perfection through control and intimidation. But what we'd built in its place was actually perfect in a way she could never have understood. It was a community where everyone belonged, where differences were celebrated rather than feared, and where neighbors protected each other from those who would do them harm. I pulled out my phone and called my old partner one more time. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I've been thinking about your question. About consulting on more cases, yeah?" The answer is yes, but not just consulting, training, teaching communities how to protect themselves before they need federal intervention. That's a great idea, Marcus. The Bureau would definitely support something like that. Good, because there are a lot of neighborhoods out there that deserve what we've built here. And there are a lot of Margaret Whitmores who need to learn that communities aren't as defenseless as they think. As I ended the call and prepared to go inside, I took one last look around my neighborhood. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new problems to solve, new ways to strengthen what we'd built together. But tonight, justice had been served not just in courtrooms, but in the laughter of children playing safely in their yards, in the conversations of neighbors who no longer feared each other, and in the quiet satisfaction of a community that had faced its greatest threat and emerged stronger than before. Justice isn't just served in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins on your own front porch, with the simple decision to stand up for what's right, no matter who's trying to tear it down. And in Willowbrook Estates, on a warm evening 2 years after our darkest hour, justice looked exactly like home should look: safe, welcoming, and filled with the kind of neighbors who would always have each other's backs. The community we'd built wasn't just diverse. It was resilient. It wasn't just peaceful, it was prepared. And it wasn't just my home, it was our home, protected by people who understood that the best defense against those who would divide us is simply refusing to be divided. As I turned off my porch light and headed inside, I smiled at the thought that somewhere out there, Margaret Whitmore was spending another night in federal prison, probably still convinced that she'd been the victim of some great injustice. She still didn't understand what she'd really been up against. Not just one retired FBI agent, but an entire community that refused to let fear win. And that, I thought as I locked my door and turned in for the night, was the most beautiful justice of all. Beautiful justice of all.